Welcome, everyone, to Homeless in San Diego. My name is Greg Angel, your host, and I'm joined today by Dr. Jennifer Nations, who is the Managing Director of Homelessness Hub at my alma mater, UC San Diego. Welcome, Dr. Nations.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us. We were talking a little bit about the background of the Homelessness Hub at UC San Diego. For our listeners, they may have seen recent media coverage of a study that you led on outcomes in emergency shelters, homeless
Mhm.
shelters here locally. So we're going to talk more about that today, but we're really going to do a deeper dive on homelessness in San Diego, the data that is currently available to identify what's working well, where our gaps are, where our
Mm.
challenges are, and what we don't have and where we need to go. And you are an expert on these things. I'm so excited and thankful that you took the time to join us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So, where should we start? Let's start with a little bit about why do we need a homelessness hub, and why are you doing this work? You can do so many things in this world, but you're choosing to work on homelessness.
I love that question. Well, so the first part of the question, why do we need this? I think a couple reasons. One is it's very helpful for providers, for policymakers to have evaluations of ongoing programs. And so, and we see, government hiring evaluators all the time, right, to study and assess their programs. We think it's really important to have a university research entity in that space because of the skill sets we can bring in, the interdisciplinary nature of the expertise we can draw on. Also because we're local, we're focused here locally in San Diego County. We work very hard to be trauma informed in our approach. We work very hard to have relationships with a wide range of people, to collaborate with researchers at our other area universities, people with lived experience of homelessness. So we think we have, a unique set of skill and talent and ability that we can bring to bear on the issue locally. But because we are here, we can also be brought in for deeper conversations, right? So if we complete an evaluation of a program, we're still here, we're still embedded in the community. And so we can come in and continue to talk about that program. So it's not one and done, it's not in and out. It's, we're here, we're in the community, this is our space. Um, Knowing what programs work, how well, how they could be improved, I think is vital, especially in a time where we're continuing to think about um, insufficient resources and where we might put them. So I think we play a really important role in being able to think through those challenges and think through where we might support and direct assistance. That's helpful for philanthropy as well as they consider where are the programs where they really might want to continue support because we know it's effective. In terms of why I'm doing this as opposed to other things, I had, like a crossroads in 2020. Job was ending, kids are home at home, right? Like, where I had to make some hard decisions about what was going to happen next. And in the postdoctoral fellowship that I had done work with a variety of different local community organizations focused on a variety of social issues.
Mm-hmm.
And one was housing and homelessness. And that was the space where it was just very clear that there was so much local talent and thought leadership, but sort of a lack of infrastructure around consistent data communication and sharing, and even expertise and collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
Where not to say no one was doing anything in this space because they were, right? But there was a very kind of clear opening that we thought really needed to be filled and addressed. I am the kind of person that likes to, I think you're probably the same way, says, oh, that seems like a really impossible problem. Let me jump into that.
Where there are major gaps and inefficiencies and big problems, there's huge opportunity.
Right. Yes.
So, you're your PhD is in sociology. I'm curious. You mentioned that you were working in a number of fields, but housing and homelessness, you saw a need for better infrastructure and for more for better data is kind of what I heard you share. Why do you think that is? Why do you think there has been a lack, or there's less of that in that field compared this field compared to any other fields that you were involved with?
With homelessness, I'll back up for a second. So with the other sort of areas that I was working on and sort of building collaborations in, those were spaces, related to criminal justice, related to immigration. And it was two things. It was both the presence of the sort of people power and capacity, but then the sort of lack of connectivity, right? People talk about siloing in this space a lot.
Hmm.
And so it was both of those things together, that there were a number of different people saying, oh, there are gaps in our knowledge. Oh, there are gaps in data. Oh, there are gaps, right? So many people sort of acknowledging that. So a clear sort of opportunity. I think, too, coming out of the discipline of sociology, there's a lot of different, sociology sort of does it all in terms of the areas of focus. But I've always been driven to doing research that really looks at state capacity, government capacity to intervene to support people in the kind of lowest income situations. And with homelessness, right, we've got poverty, income inequality being big drivers there, and the role of government providing something that the market really cannot provide. And so I think it was topically very important, on a personal level, but also just seeing need. And then, yeah, the opportunity piece of it. Great organizations, great people doing a lot of important work, but kind of a clear lane for our public research university to step in and contribute.
There's also such a diversity of institutions involved in homelessness,
Yes.
right? So you have locally in San Diego, 18 different cities all working to address it, with 18 different mayors and
Hmm.
councils who are all being asked by their voters to address this growing issue of homelessness. Then you have the county of San Diego, then you have the state, federal government. These are all just government entities. That's not
Right.
even getting into providers like Interfaith Community Services, other stakeholder groups.
Mm.
So I think it's it's easy to understand when we look at it from that perspective, just how how siloed the systems
Mm.
become, and how and the need for analysis of systems performance across all these cities, across the entire region, focused on what really matters, why we care about this issue, the people
Mm.
who are experiencing homelessness, and what's working well, where are the gaps, and
Mm.
what do we need to do as a society better to help people not experience it, or when they do, to experience it as briefly as possible.
Absolutely. And the value of that coming from an institution like UC San Diego is high because we don't have skin in the game
Yeah.
in the sense of, we're not lining up for those same funding sources.
Hmm.
And we're really trying hard to make a system work without necessarily having to benefit from the system in any way. So I think that kind of outsider status can be valuable. So while we have a community advisory board and we work really hard to listen to all of those provider partners and government partners as much as we can, because they really are the experts on the ground, right? I mean, we don't live it day to day as a provider, certainly not as people, having experienced homelessness. And so listening to all those voices is vital to our work. But then at the end of the day, we aren't rewarded by the same things. And so our motivation can be independent.
Absolutely. All right, so let's talk about your latest report. As I mentioned earlier, it's gotten a fair amount of media coverage. It was the title of the report, and we'll link to it in the show notes for our listeners, is Passing Through and Staying Put, Emergency Shelter Trajectories in San Diego County, 2018 to 2023. So I know what the headlines have been in some of the local media. The opportunity we have today is to go beyond headlines and to go beyond a 2 or a 3 minute story or a brief newspaper article, but to really get into what you, as the one of the lead researchers on this project, have really found through this
Mm.
work. So with that, I'm turning it over to you, Dr. Nations, to share about what you found here that you think is most important for listeners here who are listening to a podcast about homelessness, who want to know more. What you want to share about what you found.
Well, I think first of all, for people who are engaged in this space deeply, you people won't be surprised by what they see and hear. So anyone who is a shelter provider is not going to be surprised. Anyone who's trying to help a person experiencing homelessness navigate out of homelessness to resolve their homelessness is not going to be shocked.
I can attest to that. Yes. From my perspective, yes.
Yeah. And so that, we learned from folks in that position, but that's not the audience because we know they know. The audience is much more, this is sort of like a report card in a way.
Hmm.
Thinking about the system, right? Not singling out providers, but thinking about how is the system as a whole functioning.
Would you say the shelter system, or is it broader than that?
I do think it's broader than that because
Okay.
we cannot talk about shelter outcomes without talking about what comes next.
Got it.
And if what comes next is very rarely a housing opportunity, then our shelter system just can't operate well.
Yep.
So, I think the banner findings are most people are exiting our emergency shelters not into housing, but into other kind of temporary situations, whether that be shelters, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, which are all time limited programs. Well, some shelters are not time limited, but that's a problem in and of itself. Um, but, temporary accommodations is what we call them. That's where most people are going into other temporary accommodations from emergency shelters, or they are going into street homelessness. That's not what anybody wants. What we want to see is people moving into housing, and they are doing that because they have been able to navigate themselves there, right? They've found a situation, they regained a job, they recovered, reconnected with family, whatever it might be, or because our workers at our shelters or our outreach workers, whoever they might be, have been able to help a person find something affordable, maybe permanent supportive housing if they need, support for disabilities or some kind of illness, etc. But that's not happening enough to actually see people enter emergency shelter and then frequently exit into housing. So because of that, some people, their stays in shelters are very short. They, as we wrote in the report, pass through. Some people are cycling through repeatedly, though. A little under 50% went through emergency shelters more than once in a 6-year period. And then some people are staying for longer extended periods of time. And so we really break down in the report a little bit of demographics. I mean, it's a descriptive report, demographics about who is sort of following which trends. But I think the big takeaway is the emergency shelter system cannot help people navigate out of homelessness if there aren't enough spots for them to go after the fact.
To give our readers a sense of scale here, if I'm reading the report correctly, you found that emergency shelters in San Diego over this broadly 6-year period served 8,309 unique individuals.
Yeah, and this wouldn't include domestic violence shelters, so that's an
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
caveat.
Okay. So more than 8,000 individuals. That's roughly 1/3 of 1% of the population, to
Mm.
put it in context. So a significant amount of people here in San Diego, throughout the county. Um, I have some questions and some like observations that really stuck out to me. But before I share those, what else do you want our listeners to think about or consider if they're interested in learning more about this report or just understanding the findings?
I think a couple things are important to think about with a report like this. We're looking backwards, right? It's 2018 to 2023. We're looking historically. We're also looking at a period with a lot of change and volatility.
That would be an understatement.
That
As you mentioned, that little thing called COVID is right in the
little thing
middle.
called
Yeah,
COVID.
yeah.
Yeah, where you had consistent increases in the numbers of people experiencing homelessness, but a rise and then a fall in the number of beds available to people. So that's an important part of the story here.
And if I could jump in as a
Mhm.
as a provider who was here providing these services during that time period, I can share that there was an increase in funding dollars available to provide shelter during COVID, and so but at the same time, shelter here in North County really changed.
Mhm.
So we've always had a very small number of like traditional brick and mortar shelters in North San Diego County, just usually less than a couple hundred beds in all of North County, and
Mhm.
we're talking. Your report identifies thousands of shelter beds throughout the larger county. So we have a smaller number here in North County. But during COVID, there were some resources that allowed us to utilize hotels
Mhm.
that were closed at the heyday of lockdown era regulations, COVID era regulations. We were able to utilize hotels to provide shelter to people who needed to shelter in place. They were health conditions, and there were other similar resources that increased the amount of shelters. In your report details that. So I think it's a good observation that this report covers a time where 2018 did not look like 2020, and 2023 certainly does not look like 2021, because that wave of resources that came during COVID,
Mhm.
it was a wave. It came and it went.
Yeah. Yeah. But the thing that continued unabated was increase in living costs. And so you had the forces that are sort of pushing people into that first time homelessness category, or maybe re-entering homelessness after some previous experience. That continued, where the provision of programming or funding changed pretty drastically. It also we The other important thing is just that this is a one in a series of reports. So our first one was released about 6 months before this one, and it gets much more into what you're talking about in terms of so we mention it in this one, but our previous report, which is called Homelessness Trends and Overnight Emergency Services in San Diego County, it really gets into those counts about where are shelter beds being provided, how did that change over time, really picks up the hotel motel voucher
Mm,
issue
yeah.
because of how much that expanded and then shrunk. And we'll continue to do work in that particular space.
So we'll link to that report as well. That's important. And I'll share from our perspective, because here at Interfaith Community Services, we've operated both traditional brick and mortar emergency shelters, where we operate a 24/7 facility that is dedicated to that function, a shelter function. We've also, as I mentioned, operated shelters based out of hotels.
Mhm.
We've done that both when the hotel was entirely leased out or
Mhm.
available exclusively for shelter during COVID. We've also done it where there's just a small number of vouchers interspersed with a larger
Mhm.
hotel population. And I will share that our experience is that a hotel is not situated to provide the type of support that a shelter dedicated exclusively to helping people with the challenges that come with homelessness. The hotel does not replace one, and in many cases, it can be an environment that is not supportive,
Mhm.
and that leads to a lot of people who have been on the streets for a long time. They may have experiences living in a hotel when they can afford it.
Mm,
And there may be a lot of people in those hotels who are doing things that are not helpful for their own situation.
mm,
And so providing shelter in that same environment doesn't, can often be triggering and just not a helpful environment. It also usually comes with, in our experience, lesser levels of staff support.
yeah.
And so it just is not as effective. That one of the reasons that it has been utilized so much is that it is in many cases either cheaper or it's able to actually be sited and created.
Mm,
Trying to
hmm
build and permit and place a shelter is one of the most challenging development tasks you can be faced with.
mm,
Using some vouchers at an existing hotel, most people can do that without having to
mm,
necessarily go through all the process. And so we've seen locally a lot of those hotel voucher shelters be created because of expediency.
mhm,
So when we thinking about your comment about how we have really a scarcity model of addressing homelessness,
mhm,
not only is there a scarcity of funds, there's a scarcity of local support through the form of permitting to allow a shelter to be located and operated in communities where people are experiencing homelessness. That lack of support leads to utilizing things like hotels as shelters.
mhm.
And hotels are just not a very good place for shelters from our perspective at Interfaith Community Services.
Yeah. No, I think I've heard that from providers before that depending on what the client needs, being isolated in a room might not be ideal. So it probably really depends on the person and what they need. If it's, sometimes domestic violence organizations will use hotel and motel vouchers to good effect,
Hmm.
as they're waiting on another option. But again, like, yeah, is it sort of removed from the other places people need to go? That could be another issue is transportation, right? So shelter might be more centrally located, but a hotel motel might be sort of a little bit further out. There are those kinds of issues. But just building on your point about siting, it's not just right, can we site shelters? It's also the housing piece. So sometimes housing developers see purchasing a hotel or motel and doing a small conversion, creating it into multifamily housing as the low hanging fruit because it's so hard to get a community to support a brand new building. And so, the city of San Diego has received state funding to do that. I'm sure other entities have as well. But again, yeah, so in the housing category, it makes a lot of sense, right?
Hmm.
Because that's
Hmm.
what we're moving toward anyway, is that kind of private accommodation. But I could see why it just is really going to depend on the client for whether a congregate shelter or at least one where you have a variety of services on site would serve them better than potentially like an isolated room.
Well, I think an important takeaway is that shelters don't solve homelessness,
Yes.
right? Only housing does that. And often, a lot of person centered services, meeting people where they're at, are really important to getting to that housing. And sometimes shelters can be a critical place where those are provided.
Hmm.
And sometimes shelters can be can be literally a room without the amount of services that people need, or an
Hmm.
environment that is not helpful, or in a location that is not helpful for them, right?
Yeah.
So there's one shelter is not are not all shelters. They're not all the same, and they're only a means to an end, right? So we need to be focused on how they are effectively a means to an end, and where the gaps are, and how we can improve them.
Yes.
And that's what your report, I think, does. Your reports, I should say, your studies are doing a really effective job of highlighting.
Thank you. And I think I'm self conscious of, one of the things we've said in both is although we identify a real lack or insufficient level of shelter beds for the people we know who are experiencing homelessness, we don't support a massive increase in shelter capacity. We really, because, like you said, shelters don't solve homelessness. And we have a problem in San Diego County, which is that we talk about housing first, but we rarely actually do housing first because housing first literally means that the housing is first, not shelter first, not treatment first, housing first. And so, um, we could double the number of shelter beds, but then we'll see the same trends,
Hmm.
right? We'll see people passing through sometimes repeatedly, or we'll see people staying for extended periods of time as they're waiting for that magic placement or, that reconnection with family, whatever it might be that gets them into housing. The thing that is so constraining, though, is people's ability to earn enough income to pay rent. And I think most people in San Diego can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
But when we think about the actual income capacity, earning capacity for a lot of folks that have fallen into homelessness in San Diego County, we're talking about very, very low amounts of income. And so even what we call affordable housing in the county is not affordable from the standpoint of someone, bringing in $1,200, $1,400 with their minimum wage part-time job or there's, supplemental security income.
Well, and I want to call out a really important part of your study, which identifies that of those 8,093 individuals who were in shelters over a 6-year period, 63% reported disabling condition. So when you talk about earning potential and the fact that homelessness is an economic problem of somebody not being able to afford housing, when 63% of sheltered individuals are disabled, their ability to earn enough income to pay for housing is by definition very limited.
Yeah, I mean, I think what all of us can think about how we, in our households individually would weather an economic storm. Someone loses a job, someone gets injured on the job, someone in the family needs care, whatever it might be, you get evicted. Our ability to weather those kinds of storms and maintain our lives can be severely threatened. So if your capacity for weathering any of those kinds of moments is very constrained by mental, physical disability, substance use, addiction, then the likelihood that you become unhoused increases. And, in terms of the qualitative data that we collect at Homelessness Hub, um, it's oftentimes stories of there was a crisis because of my income or whatever my kind of economic situation is. I couldn't weather it, and I went through every person I knew to ask for help, or I was so ashamed that I didn't reach out to some of those people, or I was afraid to, right? That this sort of combination of financial emergency or something like that, ability to recover from that, and then our social networks really make it so that that's where we see people losing their housing and struggling to regain it.
Thank you for going through the qualitative findings that Homelessness Hub is identifying and sharing with our listeners the combination of challenges and the economic storms that people are
Mhm.
experiencing that often lead to homelessness. Because I invite our listeners to think about that and then to think about how if you or somebody you know was in that situation, suffered loss of job, had an injury, dealing with a disability, um, any number of challenges, you lose your housing. You either have asked everyone you know for help and they're not able to provide it, or
Yeah.
you're not willing to, you're ashamed to ask for help, and all these things. Anyways, you're literally on the streets. So, what does a shelter look like that is going to help you overcome that situation? And how does a shelter actually help you? And where I'm going with this is that my guess is that if somebody's walking through this and thinking about how they would feel, what they'd be experiencing, and what they would like to see in terms of a helpful
Mm.
resource, they're probably not looking at 1,000-bed mega shelter. They're probably not looking at a large 100-bed facility of any type, right? Whether that's a tent or a building or anything. And even if they're looking at something that's smaller, like we used to operate a 49-bed shelter here at this location, 24 bunk beds and a bed. We had 49 beds in a large room. Probably doesn't look like that either.
Mm.
That could be a scary thing to go into. And how does that help somebody overcome all those financial challenges?
I mean, it in and of itself can't. So it's
Right.
really
Right.
right. So it's really about what do we do to address the immediate need of you need somewhere safe to go.
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, sometimes shelters aren't super safe, right? And in fact, the one story I do tell in this report about someone we interviewed who was actually living in a downtown single room occupancy hotel. He had all of his belongings stolen at the convention center. So for all the things the convention center got right, there were still problems of that nature, and that's not the only place where that happens. Um, happened. I mean, just to be
Hmm.
clear,
Hmm.
convention center's not open anymore. But so this is where I think transitional housing, rapid rehousing can be really valuable. And back to kind of what we were saying about vouchers versus shelters. Um, it depends on the person's needs. It depends on what level of care they need. But the first thing we have to do is just make sure that person's got somewhere safe to sleep. So I think sometimes bridge shelters, are thought of in that way. We just need to immediately get this person off the streets, out of the elements, away from potentially being exposed to violence or crime, somewhere safe. What comes after that? And I think, one of the things that's hard to do well in a shelter of any kind is help a person deal with trauma. The process of becoming homeless can be very traumatizing. So that can be very difficult. Um, the ability of that shelter, it's really going to depend on, do they have the staffing necessary to help people navigate and find those next steps? Or does it feel more like a waiting space where people are just waiting? And I don't have, this project was not evaluating specific shelters, but I do get the sense that we have programs where people are, they're sort of waiting and biding their time much more than they are getting deep support to navigate. We have a lot of program providers that are doing that work, to be clear. But yeah, I don't think it's shelter. Shelter does one thing well,
What's
which
that?
is it's not being on the street.
Exactly. Exactly.
But there are people for whom that feels so restraining, right? It feels like a containment strategy that they would prefer the independence of being outside, in a tent, in the riverbed, whatever it might be. And so, yeah, they're very limited in what they can do.
Well, and the reason I'm going down these roads, and I don't know, it occurs to me somebody could be listening to this and be like, okay, well, he doesn't like hotels because that's this triggering and too isolating, maybe. Doesn't like the big rooms because that's too many people. So what's the answer, right? Where I'm going with all of this is that a shelter is absolutely necessary to be able to provide a safe place when people have no place else to go. Still, it may not be right for everybody, but at least it can be an option, right? So it's critical there, but it's not going to end anyone's homelessness magically on its own. The key question is, what are people able to do once they're in the shelter to end their homelessness that they're not able to do while they're out on the streets? And in your study, you share that you're in a section that talks about frequency of stays and how there are individuals who have multiple shelter stays over this 6 year study period who clearly are struggling to overcome homelessness because they're coming back to shelter repeatedly. You share that multiple pilot programs in San Diego show that integrated teams that collaboratively address health and social care are most successful at ending such cycles, talking about cycling in and out of shelters, particularly when they have sufficient resources to provide intensive case management and housing support. Can you share a little bit more about that observation?
Yeah. When we have a situation where a person is, say, in an emergency shelter or a hotel motel voucher program, which goes in that emergency shelter category, and they are given a list of referrals or they are told to call 211, uh, that can be very discouraging and can lead to no improvement. So what we hear is, well, yeah, sure, I called all of those numbers and I didn't get an answer, or they didn't have the space. And so we very much rely on the person to navigate a series of bureaucracies. We do have providers that try to do that warm handoff, they call it, right, where they are doing a lot of that navigation support. Um, but that's just one issue.
Hmm.
The other is so dependent on, um, again, the what an individual person needs. So I think that's what can be hard because again, there are going to be people that they really just need 3 months of rent or 6 months of rent. And those are the cases that, where we see resolution because again, they're able to recover from that economic shock. They just needed a little bit of help. It's the cases where you've got some kind of limiting factor, whether that's, say, a disability, um, or severe mental health challenges, and we've got sort of a limit on the number of places those folks can go long term. So permanent supportive housing, really, really vital, especially for our folks. Like if we want to disrupt patterns of cycling through shelters, that's where we see even higher rates of disability. So if we want to disrupt those kinds of patterns, that's where we see a deep need for this kind of intensive case management, where it's just very unlikely that person is going to be able to hold a steady job consistently and come up with rent, especially at the prices we have them. And so, some kind of ongoing longer term support is really vital. That's a minority of the folks that we're talking about here. But if we're, really want to significantly address chronic homelessness, street homelessness, we have to get very serious about that. Um, so that's what I mean by that is that it's not enough to provide that overnight stay, that bed, where potentially you have some access to basic needs like bathroom, shower, and a place to sleep. There's just this whole array of programming that needs to come along with it for that group of folks that just need a lot more guidance and support.
Yeah, let me give an example of that.
Sure.
So I mentioned that we used to operate a 49 bed shelter here at our Escondido headquarters. In fall of 23, we closed that shelter for a couple reasons. First, there was hardly any funding to support it, and we had about more than $1 million funding deficit every year. It was not sustainable for us as an organization. Second, the people we were serving were largely facing multiple disabilities. They
Mm,
were among the most medically fragile group of unsheltered that we had served in the decade that we had been operating that particular shelter.
mm,
And at the same time, earlier that year, we had opened an expanded home for our recuperative care center for people who are either coming out of hospitals or have health conditions. And what we realized is that at the time of us closing our shelter, more than 80% of our shelter residents, they actually qualified for the recuperative care program. And they were a much better fit for recuperative care, where you have um, you have intensive case management, you have more robust supportive services to help people navigate both health challenges, establishing income,
mm,
overcoming traumas, stabilizing, right? We see that as much more effective than a traditional shelter that has less support. Why? Because there just isn't the funding to support it.
mhm,
Um, the study that we're talking about here talks about shelters that are, I would say, predominantly in the city of San Diego. Um, as challenging as this report is, I'll make it even more challenging to say these are actually well funded, or
mm,
these shelters are very well funded compared to the ones that we operate in
mm,
North San Diego County.
yeah.
And I'll put a dollar amount to it. Shelters in the city receive funding support in the 60 to $100 per night range, maybe even a little bit more. Our North County shelters have funding that's less than $10 a bed night. And so all the providers have to then scrounge and find other resources. And what happens? Well, you don't have the behavioral health clinician that you might have at another shelter. You
Mm,
don't have the peer support specialist who's been there, who's lived that experience, who can who
mm,
can connect with somebody in a more effective way. So I hope this is helpful for our listeners to understand that we have a shelter system that's really struggling, right? But to your point earlier, it's not about a shelter system, it's this broader system that we're in, where
mm,
the shelter is just one point in time, where the actual the actual short-term housing is not going to help most people overcome homelessness. It can be a important part of that,
Hmm.
but it for most people, again, 63% shelter residents have a disability in the report. Most people need a little bit more support. And then on top of that, they're probably going to need a little bit more support after they move into housing if they're able to do so.
Absolutely. And that's why it was really important to us to have this whole section where we looked at where were people going after they exited shelters. Because that's going to be our best benchmark for what's happening.
Hmm.
'Cause shelters, yeah, they exist to facilitate an improvement, right? But if what is happening is people are going back into a different shelter or are going back onto the street, then they're not performing that function. So they are, for some folks, right? And that's
Yeah.
important.
Yeah.
It does work sometimes,
Absolutely.
but can it work more? Yes, but we have to think about, yes, it's not just the shelter provision. Just on your earlier point about sort of different cities and what different cities are doing and how they kind of show up in this report,
Hmm.
our, you know, North County has opened two shelters, the Vista Encinitas shared shelter, and then in Oceanside, the rescue mission.
Hmm.
Those really don't make much of a cameo in this report because they're so new. And so, yeah, North County, so interfaith would really be the primary thing represented in this report. So yeah, we don't see. There's not a lot of information, honestly. This doesn't reflect a lot about North County, and that's an important caveat. The other is that we have had a lot of growth, not huge, right, but important sources of growth in shelter capacity outside of the city.
Mm.
That's important to point to
Yeah.
because I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of, oh, is it only the city of San Diego doing anything? And that's absolutely not the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah. Yeah.
The city of San Diego also has access to funding mechanisms that the other 17, I mean, maybe outside Chula Vista, there's 16 cities don't have.
Hmm.
And that's really important to understand as well. Like if for a city like Escondido, Carlsbad, to step into this space, it's not that there's no state funding, right? But it just works differently. They
Hmm.
can't, as a city, apply for the same types of financing. So they're working more with the continuum of care, right? And like coordinating. So it's important differences.
Yeah, definitely. And we see as a provider the importance of helping people access care in the community that they are from and that they're a part of, right? And so when somebody is unsheltered here in Escondido, they are usually here because it's their community. Our homeless outreach teams engage in complete assessments with everyone they provide case management to here in Escondido. And we know from those assessments that 75 to 80% of unsheltered here in Escondido are here because they were either born here, they were raised here, their family lives here, or their last place of residence, their last permanent place of residence was here. And so if somebody is homeless here in Escondido, they're from here, this is their community, it's they're already disrupted and in chaos by virtue of being homeless. To then further disrupt them and take them to Oceanside or another community or San Diego is not the most productive way. So we really do need these places within each community where people are experiencing homelessness. But to your point, the resources to pay for that
Mhm.
really are not really existent. There aren't enough resources. The city, um, these smaller cities have a harder time putting together interventions for their community members. It's a
Mm.
very challenging situation. Again, supporting the need for the data and the analysis that you
Mhm.
and your colleagues at the Homelessness Hub are doing to show, hey, some of stuff is working for 25% of the people. This worked,
Yeah,
but none of us are happy with that. None of us are satisfied.
I hope not. I hope
And
nobody's satisfied by that.
right, and you identified in the report that it's challenging to compare us to other communities because of lack of data and because every community is a little different. But when we look at a couple of comparisons, Santa Clara County, Los Angeles County, we see higher rates of success. Still
Mm.
not great. I mean, it's in the 30s, like 37, 33%. I forget the exact figures, but
Mm.
but significantly higher than what we're seeing here in San Diego County.
Mhm.
Um, So we're going to wrap up the episode before we go too much longer. But what do you see going forward? What's more data that you want to, more work that you and your colleagues want to do? What else do you want to make sure to share today as we talk about the work that you've been doing? Any of the topics that we're discussing?
Yeah. One is that we'll continue to do this type of sort of descriptive analysis where we're looking at years of data to understand trends over time. We've really benefited from a partnership with the regional task force and their willingness to share data with us, de-identified but still really important data sources. We're also really looking forward to future collaborations. So, we've been in conversations with the San Diego County Office of Evaluation, Performance and Analytics about the types of work they're doing and the ways that a research university can collaborate with them to extend, elevate. Again, and this is very much about us having know-how in data collection with a particular population, having relationships, and kind of being able to deploy researchers um, and then I think, along with a variety of our government entities as well as our continuum of care lead, our TFH, really thinking about what comes next. So this kind of, backward looking report is important because it hasn't been done and we really need to think about these trends. And again, like having an impartial party do that, I think is a value added, but we need more in terms of gaps analysis. So that's what we're looking to next is really thinking about, there are local entities that have done this, but not consistently.
Hmm.
And so for us, that's identifying who on our team, who on campus, who on some of our, our other university campuses in the region can work with us to expand that type of work where we think about, all right, well, we have these historical numbers. We've looked at that data now. We can use that to think about what do we need in 5 years, in 10 years? Are there ways that we can also think about not just those numbers, but what is it about the way the system is working, the way that government, cities and county and RTFH, like what is it about how they are working together or not coordinating that we can improve to streamline these efforts and just do more to, make shelters more successful and even make shelters just not the most critical part of the equation that actually becomes housing.
Really, really important points. And I'll reiterate that the only thing that ends homelessness is housing. And when we think about a homeless shelter system where 63% of the clients are disabled, we really need housing options for them. We've talked a lot about it today. We need shelters that support those individuals and provide robust support and services. But all those services don't make a difference if at the end of the day there isn't an affordable place with some additional supportive services that they can move into. I mentioned our recuperative care center that we opened a couple of years ago in its new expanded home. When I was talking with our team recently, just asking them kind of what questions I always ask our teams here. What are your biggest challenges? What
Mm,
are the biggest challenges you're facing? This is a post hospitalization recuperative care center. People coming literally out of emergency rooms with multiple medical
mm,
conditions, and the answer is not access to healthcare is just a challenge. The answer isn't ongoing access to behavioral health services is a challenge. The answer isn't so many things that you might think it would be for a post hospitalization recuperative care center. The biggest challenge is housing. We
mm,
can't find affordable places for people to move out. We can stabilize them. We can help them get to where they need to be. They can't stay here forever.
mm.
And eventually they need a place that they can afford, that they can move on to. So for our listeners, we always talk about calls to action here,
Yeah.
Dr. Nations. And so to our listeners, I have two points I want to make that are calls to action. First, we need more housing. We need affordable housing of all types. We especially need permanent supportive housing. Second, when we look at how the heck are we going to pay for this stuff, more and more of services directed at home around addressing homelessness are utilizing healthcare revenues.
Mm,
Because again, when 63% of your shelter residents are disabled, you have a healthcare problem
Hmm.
just as much as you have a homelessness problem. And so, thankfully, Medicaid, administered as Medi-Cal here in the state of California, is more and more a pivotal revenue stream to provide these services, and even now to provide housing support.
Hmm.
We actually can access somebody's health insurance to pay for them to move into housing, because the health insurance companies know that their member will be a lot
Yeah.
healthier in their own home than they will in the streets, right? Well, all that is threatened by potential cuts to Medicaid
Yeah.
uh, at the federal level. So for our listeners, Medicaid, we call it Medi-Cal here locally, is vital to better addressing the problems that we're talking about today. It is under attack. It is under threat in the years ahead. We need to preserve it. So my calls to action are more housing and protect Medicaid, which, by the way, insures 1 in 3 San Diegans.
Hmm.
More than a
That's
million
huge.
people in San Diego
Yeah.
this last year received their health insurance through Medicaid. So very important that we preserve it. Uh, so some calls to action from me. Dr. Nations, as we wrap up today, what would you encourage our listeners to do? And what else would you like to share before we wrap up?
I'm going to say a couple things that are unpopular.
Oh, good. I like it.
I mean, so on the federal funding front,
Yeah.
community development block grants are what some of our smaller cities in the county rely on for housing and even some shelter funding and
Mm-hmm.
homelessness outreach funding. That's also, that runs through HUD, also potentially under threat. And
Mm-hmm.
so, yeah, call your federal lawmakers, complain, because if we as communities are legitimately interested in not seeing people unhoused on our streets, then we have to fight for the programs that help them get off the streets.
And we at Interfaith utilize those community development block grant dollars for homeless prevention.
Yeah,
We prevent people from falling into homelessness. We do that specifically right now in Carlsbad and here in Escondido. Those are potentially under threat. So that's from HUD, community development block grant dollars to preserve.
absolutely vital. Yes. And such a vital source for, again, all of our cities in the county, but our smaller cities in particular. There's also, of course, other ways that HUD impacts the ability of cities to build housing or do rental supports and things like that. I mentioned that. So that's really important. The other two things that I think are these are the unpopular things. One is that you can't you can't oppose housing for people who are exiting homelessness in your community and also expect to not see homelessness in your community. And the idea that some other city is shipping people into my city it's demonstrably false. We just over and over again find exactly what you were saying about Escondido, folks experiencing homelessness in Escondido. The vast majority are from here. They became homeless here. They maybe lost their job. We see that. I live in Oceanside. It's the same in Oceanside. I know that from qualitative data collection, but we also know this from more systematic survey data collection. It's true throughout the county. So the idea that any city in our county gets to say, "Oh, it's not our problem. Send people downtown. That's where they came from," is not true. And if you can't figure out how to be part of the solution to building permanent supportive housing, making permanent supportive housing work and work well in your community, and instead you just want to tear it down, you want to close it down, you want something else, you really cannot reasonably expect then to not see homelessness in your community. We have a situation where most of the cities and now the county in our area are banning encampments. So the idea that you can just push people out is also very false. The last thing I'll say that I think is also unpopular is that we have to think about, especially in a context where the federal government might be reducing some of the support,
Mm-hmm.
what does it look like for people in a given community to band together to support people experiencing homelessness, to help them resolve their homelessness?
Hmm.
So there is the volunteer part of that. There's the find out what you can do, treat people as people, admit sometimes they've made mistakes, but does it matter? Right? People are in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and you might also have to approve taxes. So some of the work I've done is in studying kind of fiscal policy and problems, and homelessness requires funding. And so we have to be in a space where we can wrap our heads around the possibility that there are people who are just not going to be able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and might need support from a centralized entity, whether that's charitable and that's the route you want to go and you use your time and your resources, or you're ready to approve that city council measure or, that local tax that might support more housing construction or whatever.
So, couple to summarize a couple of your points that you just made. I love how you said people cannot oppose housing for individuals overcoming homelessness and expect homelessness to decrease at the same time. And also, we can't simply enforce bans or you can't be homeless here rules and expect that to reduce homelessness. You shared the data on so many fronts that you've seen supporting the reality that people who are unsheltered in a community are from that community by and large, um, and that it is up to that community to address that issue. And I love how you said, as we know that there will likely be reduction in federal funds to do this work, it's going to be up to us at the local level. Homelessness is inherently a local issue, so it's up to us to work together to do that. And
Well said.
we need resources to do that. Local tax revenues are a way to do it. City of Escondido passed a 1 cent sales tax last fall. Homelessness was one of the number one factors leading to that.
Yeah.
So they'll have 10 different city councils. It's a 20-year measure. There's a new city council every 2 years, so there'll be 10 different councils that get to determine how to utilize those resources, right? And while shelter is very important, and we do need that because is a lack of shelter beds here in Escondido,
Yeah.
we need to also create housing. Otherwise, we'll have more shelter beds that will be minimally successful.
Yep.
Well, Dr. Nations, thank you for the work that you do. Thank you for being so generous with your time. We went a little longer than we were planning. Would love to have you back in the future as you and your colleagues do more of this work. You have an open invitation to return anytime you'd like. I hope this has been a helpful place to be able to have a longer form discussion about the complexity of the issues that you're working on.
Yes, it has. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for the work that you do. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. If you have feedback, you have questions, you have things that you want us to focus on in future episodes, let us know. And we will look forward to joining you again next episode. Dr. Nations, thank you again for coming on.
Thanks. Great.